I'm really looking forward to speaking with my guest today. I met him when I was elected mayor of North Dumfries Township, and by virtue of that election, I became a regional councillor for the region of Waterloo, a miracle of our two-tier system. He was not an elected politician, but a person that held significant importance with respect to the operations of our regional government. He is an engineer by education and training. After a stint in real-world private practice, he joined the surreal world of public service in 1992, coming to the region of Waterloo as the manager of engineering, planning, and water resource protection. He was promoted through the ranks, becoming the director of water services, later the commissioner of transportation and environmental services, and then in 2004, becoming the chief administrative officer, the CAO, the boss of all bosses. And he stayed in that position until July 2020. As a former mayor, I can tell you that behind the success of any mayor or regional chair is an exceptional CAO. And the highest compliment that I can pay my guest today is that he was certainly that. So without further superlatives, I want to welcome Mike Murray to the Old Grey Mayors podcast. I always enjoyed my time at the region because I always enjoyed my interactions with you and the rest of the staff at the region. And when I ran for regional chair, one of the things I said was the reason I was interested in the position was recognizing what can be done with local government when you have an excellent professional staff is amazing. The things that you can accomplish when you're working with great people. And so, and that was a compliment to you, it was a compliment to the team that you put together. And it was certainly one of the things that I was, hoping if I had won to be able to work with you. But now I see you retired shortly after, so to speak.
Right.
So what have you been up to since you left the CAO position?
Well, yeah, thanks for asking. So, I worked for the region for 28 years. I was CAO for 16 of those, which, in CAO lifetimes is like quite a long time, actually.
Yeah, we're gonna get into longevity because I want to talk about that after.
Yeah. Anyway, so I was initially planning to retire in, I said, early spring of 2020.
Yes.
And I announced that in December of 2019. Anyway, so events overtook us, the global pandemic hit. And so I ended up, I found myself the last, 4 or 5 months of my time with the region, actually, managing the region's response to the global pandemic and chairing the pandemic control group, which, is not how I had planned to end my time with the region.
I know you didn't quietly ride off into the sunset.
My goodness.
And I did note that. I wanted to say thank you for your service, for spending that extra time to help us transition and get set up with that response team. And obviously you left at a point where you felt it was comfortable for you to go to hand off the baton to a group that could take it. And actually, back to Brian Stortz again, Brian and I had a chance to chat about when we talked about communication plan and we talked about SARS and all the way through and Syrian refugee and those sorts of things. But yeah, thank you very much for spending that extra time. So that was a bit of a shocker. I mean, for everyone in the world, right?
So, so I planned to leave in, April, May. By July, and I joke with people who are still at the region, the first wave of the pandemic had certainly waned by July. And so I left and things were actually in great shape. So then I blame them for, wave 2 and wave 3. But anyway, it was a pretty intense time. So I needed a break. I was actually really ready for a break after all the years and then, finishing with the pandemic. So,
well, I can't imagine. I mean, you're running the region is in and of itself, it's I don't know, $1.6 billion entity or something like that. Yep. And so you're the head of that. And then you've got to deal with the COVID thing. But since you've gone, and we'll get into that, but since you've left, what just a quick, what are you doing? Sort of, you just at
Yeah.
home, taking care of the kids?
So yeah, so my wife and I, this was part of the retirement plan. We bought a 25-acre rural property in Grey County near the little village of Walters Falls. So I've got a 25-acre rural property. We moved to a new community, which is a little hard to get established in a new community in the midst of a pandemic. I've got my bright orange tractor, 25 acres to putter around on. Around the property. We're reforesting some of it. Some of it was in cornfields, and we're working with local conservation authority to reforest it. Planting a pollinator meadow for birds and bees and butterflies.
Love it.
And then we're in the big rolling hills of Grey County, and I'm a pretty outdoorsy person. So awesome cross-country skiing in the winter, awesome cycling and hiking in the spring, summer, and fall. So lots of time outside, and I would say probably a way healthier lifestyle than I lived for.
My God!
Years.
Yeah, well, what healthier than sitting behind a desk for 16 hours a day? I don't.
Certainly more active. I spend a good chunk of each day outside, either puttering around the property or one of my outdoor activities. So it's been great, actually. Really good.
Well,
and I'm doing a little bit of consulting, which has been really interesting. My consulting is all related to cities and how to make cities better. So I work for some municipalities. I've done some work with the Ministry of Municipal Affairs. I'm working with a private company in Waterloo who markets to municipalities. So really, it's all about, I think my passion for city building continues, and just, coming at it in a slightly different way, and enough to keep my brain active in retirement.
And that's the thing about municipal politics, isn't it? City building. I mean, I think I always say to people, it's like when my girls were growing up, they had this game called Sims. And it's like, you created these cities and roads and all that stuff, and I'd watch them do their thing. But it wasn't until I became mayor that I started to realize at the local level how much you get to change and impact your community in terms of developing roads and community centers and subdivisions and planning and all of that. Like it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it really is. And lots of people don't realize how much of an impact local government has on people's day-to-day lives. And I would talk to people about that, think about your day. You get up, you get up in the morning, you turn on your tap. Well, that's municipal government at work.
Right.
Clean water's coming out your tap. You leave to go to work, whether you take transit or drive. You're interacting with your municipal government. Who's built the roads, looked after the roads, provided a public transit system. Like the list goes on and on.
Yeah.
And every facet, in some way or another, municipal government is involved in. So it's a fascinating place to work.
And it's it's reflected in our voter turnouts and everything in terms of the sort of the neglect or the lack of attention that people give to municipal politics. I even myself growing up, when you're a political file or, someone that's really keenly watching politics, you're watching the federal government, you're watching the provincial government, and you're not even noticing what's going on at your municipal level. And so certainly that has something that was really eye-opening for me for the time that I was mayor and regional councillor. I love the job; it was fantastic, and I can see why people want to. We have some politicians that stick around for such a long period of time because of all the things you get to do. I sort of call the MPs and the MPPs check deliverers sometimes.
We really like them when they do that.
Yeah, exactly. But I just want to ask you though first, before we get into, how did you end up at the region? Because I'm looking at your background and you're working in private industry, I guess, right? You're working for engineering companies and you're in weren't you in Manitoba or something before you came to Waterloo Region?
Yeah. So my background's in engineering. I had a master's in civil and environmental engineering, and my wife and so we moved to Inuvik in the Northwest Territories and spent a couple years there. And I was working for a Western Canada-based consulting engineering company, had a very small office in Inuvik, very small, like me. And then after the novelty of that wore off, after a couple of years, we went to Winnipeg and transferred with the company. And so I was living and working in Winnipeg in consulting engineering. Both my kids were born in Winnipeg. And so my wife and I were there. The work was really interesting, but we were a long way away from family. All our family was in Southern Ontario. So we decided we wanted to move back to Southern Ontario. And I actually got to a point where I actually made a really conscious decision that I wanted to work in public service, that's where my heart was, that's where my passion was. In consulting, many of our clients were municipal governments or provincial governments, like public service entities. And what I saw was they were driving the agenda. They were saying, here are the projects that we want to work on. And then as a consulting engineer, we would respond to that. We say, okay, well, we can help you build a water treatment plant or build a transit system. But I was looking at that saying, those guys in government are setting the agenda. That's what I want to do. And there was a really conscious decision to move to the public sector, move to public service. And we wanted to be in Southern Ontario. So we had a very short list of places that we wanted to go. Waterloo was one. Guelph was another one.
Guelph is a very progressive community.
Progressive communities, university town, close enough to Toronto, but not Toronto, which is where a lot of my folks were. So anyway, it was very deliberate on our part, and frankly, I had no idea what I was getting into. The region of Waterloo as manager of engineering and planning in water, and the water system in the region was in chaos at the time. And I had no idea what I was landing in the middle of. So that could be another whole conversation.
I was going to say we could just divert it. You just piqued my interest now on this whole topic. But let me and we will talk about that at a future date. Now, these are little teasers for future shows. But so you're Toronto. Were you from the Toronto area originally, born and raised, or?
Yeah, I grew up in Toronto. Yeah.
Okay, so you're looking at this, and how do you end up as a manager? Like, that's your first job as a manager. Is that the normal process?
It's highly variable. Like, I had about 7 years of experience in consulting engineering at the time. So I managed small, medium, and large projects by that point in my career. I managed a 1-person, 2-person office. And, I work in Inuvik as a consulting engineer. On contract, we were the town engineer. So, I'd probably had early career experiences that were pretty broad and pretty diverse. Yeah. And so it was a pretty natural kind of progression. A reasonably kind of entry-level job at the region. And I had no idea, what the path forward was going to be. So it wasn't like I, all my life I'd aspired to be a municipal CAO. That wasn't really my, kind of career path. But
well, that's what I tell my kids. You don't know where your career path's going to take you. You just jump in, get a job, and then figure it out from there once you go. But just two things. First off, you were mentioning, that job that you had in the north, and you were, I guess, on contract to the local municipality, so to speak, to provide service. So that's what I ran into when I became mayor in North Dumfries Township, because we contracted out our planning services at the time. So we didn't have a full-time planner on staff. And I remember, no criticism of anything, but, in this situation down here in Waterloo Region versus up there, like, this person had many clients in the area. And so now if you're one of many clients, trying to get this person's attention or focus on your work can be a little bit, difficult from a time management perspective. And I understand that. So one of the things that we did, because when I was running, I always heard from people, the township is slow to respond. You take forever to get back on things, which is probably, I think, a response that is pretty common at all levels. But we hired a full-time planner during my time, just to make sure, because I recognize quick that if anything's going to happen in your community in terms of, private sector developing and everything else, we got to open it up and make it easier for them to function and get quicker response, right?
Yeah, and absolutely. And I think you're totally right, Robin. especially the planning function, like having a dedicated person, and I think we're going to talk in a minute about the council staff relationship.
Yeah, yeah.
But having a municipal employee in that key role who reports to council is critical. Like probably of all the functions of, especially of a local municipality, planning and public works they're right up there. And so, I think that was a good call on the part of, you and township council to sort of up the game a bit on the planning file.
Yeah, because we're air itself was a bit of a growth area, and I just couldn't understand in 2010 why we wouldn't have a full-time planner on staff. And in fact, we added a junior because it was so busy. Yeah. To beef up that department, because you want to get development going and you want to get it done properly. I'm not saying the person did a bad job, but it's just when you have a lot of clients, I just know this from my law practice, or that from private practice. If you have a lot of clients, you're trying to respond to everybody and you can't get to all the work you want to get to in as timely a manner as you would like to get back to everybody. But let's go to now, you said, I want to be that guy. Okay. And that's interesting because you're pointing out basically that guy who was, the engineer or the person making those decisions was almost directing what was happening in a community. Yeah. Right? Yeah. Because the politicians, we're like, okay, I was a lawyer, fine. But, people come from all walks of life. We don't have an engineering degree. We don't have a medical degree. And now, we're expected to make decisions. So we're looking to staff to guide us with the information we need so that we can make a common sense decision.
Yeah, or make wise decisions. And I would say when I joined municipal government, it was a learning process for me, Rob, just as it was a learning process for you when you became elected mayor. Yeah. And I had to sort of navigate my way through, okay, what is the role of staff versus the role of council, and who's making what decisions? And so that was a learning process. And I don't know where you want to go with this conversation, but really what I came to understand over the first few years of my time there was big policy level kinds of decisions and direction. Those were regional council's decisions to make. And our role as staff was to provide the very best information that we could, options, pros and cons, good analysis of the financial implications, so that councillors, including you, who maybe didn't have a lot of background on the specific topic, could make well-informed, wise decisions. So that so that took me a little while to realize, is that those big policy level decisions were council, and the implementation was staff responsibility. So one of the things I characterize it as, what we're going to do was council's decision. How we're going to do it was a staff decision. And that was always sort of a good filter for me, as the what versus the how.
Sure. And I think that is good. But you know what? 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 On the what? Okay. Some elected politician might have an idea of something they want to do, but a lot of times the big ideas are staff generated.
Yeah.
The politician has to accept it, but the staff will take ION. All right. I don't think any politician said, we're going to build a rail line right down the middle. It was the CAO before you, or maybe before that person, who put that line on a map and say, hey, look, this is something we're going to do. And everyone said, oh, that makes sense. Let's look at doing that. You know what I mean? It's like,
yeah. And
I would staff is so important.
Yeah, totally. And I would say it kind of goes in both directions. So I would say some ideas were and are initiated by staff. Other ideas are initiated by individual councillors who, will bring something to council and convince council to basically direct staff to look into this, look at the feasibility of this, bring a report back on a certain issue. So like there are things that genuinely are initiated and directed by council. There are other things where staff come forward with ideas. And you take the ION, which we're going to get into. The idea of a central transit corridor had been in the region's official plan, which was, endorsed by council. It had been in the region's official plan since the 70s. So,
right.
So although the line on a map, well, how are we going to implement this, did come from my predecessor, Jerry Thompson. The concept had been, embraced by successive regional councils over a very long period of time.
But the idea didn't come from council.
Yeah, so probably not. I think probably the idea, the idea probably came from staff way back in the 70s.
Yes,
this central transit corridor. Council embraced it. The other thing, Rob, just in terms of council staff dynamics and who initiates what, one of the things that, you were part of, and I actually spent a fair amount of time with each incoming council, was working through a strategic plan. And I know some people's eyes roll back in their head when you start talking about strategic plans, but it was always my goal to genuinely work hand in hand with the incoming council to say, what are our goals and objectives for the next 4 years together as an organization? And those, you were part of those were actually really productive sessions where there'd be lots of give and take. Staff would provide a lot of background, here are the trends and issues that the community is facing. Here's a whole bunch of data. And then in a back and forth facilitated way, work with council to say, what are our collective goals and objectives for the next 4 years?
Yeah, so
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, just the two things I want to touch on. I want to follow up on this right now, and then I want to go back to a counselor with an idea and how that can happen. But yes, when you and I first met, we had that meeting in your office. I remember that distinctly. We were at your board table, and I'm newly elected as mayor. Regional council wasn't even on my radar when I was running for mayor, because back then I was like, my community center was the big project, and I was in a pretty good battle for mayor in our election. I hadn't even thought about regional council until sometime after. So when you and I met, you were very kind to take me in and say, hey, what is it you want to do? Okay. And I really, to me, it was on my part, an opportunity missed a bit, because I really didn't understand that whole dynamic. And it really wasn't much from a regional perspective that I was concerned with, because outside of, roads, and I didn't even know about the water thing back then as well. But outside of roads and water, I was, generally happy with what the region was doing for us. And so there wasn't any big issue that I had. But the planning sessions we did, yes, you just jogged my mind about that, because I remember, you're right. No, first of all, nobody likes putting together a mission statement. But anyway, that aside, 8 words or less. But anyway, strategic plan, though, you're right. That's the sort of thing. It's like, kind of thing. But it's important, because if you don't have a plan and a guiding document, where are you going? Right? I mean, it's just like a planning document, like when I'm talking about planning, like a municipal planning document, this is a strategic planning document. And one of the things that I remember I had raised, because you and I were working on this, and we're going to talk about this at another show, was that Dr. Oetker manufacturing plant. And, I was thrown into the fire in terms of trying to see what we can do, and you were helping me out, and it was great. And so at that first strategic planning session, it was like a green light session. What do you think we should do? What should we be working on? And I remember saying economic development. And I remember a counselor right away saying, we don't do economic development. And I'm like, okay, I'll be quiet. Because it's one of those kind of like, you're new to class, and someone who's been there a while shouts something back at you, and now suddenly you're gun shy about saying anything after that.
Yeah, but Rob, I think this is a really good example of the value of those strategic planning sessions in terms of providing an opportunity for individual councillors or the majority of council to really influence the direction, right? And I think as a result of that, actually the whole field of economic development in Waterloo Region, like writ large, that did become a theme, I think, in that strategic plan. And basically an acknowledgement that, you know what, collectively, we need to do better at this.
Yeah, because we had Schneider's going on at the time too, and Dr. Oker left us to go to London. And so it was like, what the hell's going on kind of thing.
Right. And, you know, how do we collectively, as a community, how do we up our game on economic development? So this was one of those, I think, really good examples of, you know, staff providing some, you know, context for council around, we're doing okay, but there's a lot of competitive pressures around us. And then councillors saying, yeah, and, you know, we need to do better in the broad field of economic development. We need to figure out how the region and the area municipalities and the private sector can work better together. And, you know, that became a bit of a focus. And I would say regional staff embraced that and said, okay, we need to bring back some ideas, some options to regional council. And we'll talk about it more, I think, hopefully in another chat. But, you know, that eventually gave rise to Waterloo Region Economic Development Corporation.
Yeah, I think the time was right. And it might almost be a bit of an indictment on our two-tier system because, you know, there was a lot of walking on eggshells about economic development. And I didn't realize any of this up until that point because the cities all had their own looking at, you know, domestic economic development. And so CTT became this international economic development. So everyone could say, okay, yeah, we'll all contribute money to that because they're looking at foreign opportunities and the mayors would go on their junkets. But, you know, it was sort of like, okay, this is a way in to start it. But eventually, and some might say if we had the Economic Development Council that we have now, may have avoided some lost opportunities, right?
It's, who knows, that's hindsight.
Yeah,
but
I know.
You know,
but it's kind of interesting.
WEDC is doing great. And
Tony Lamia is excellent at that job.
And it did come out of one of those, you know, strategy sessions where staff and council, you know, worked hand in hand to say, what are some important issues that the organization and the community need to tackle? And then staff did some good work, brought some options back to council, and, you know, we moved the agenda forward on that.
And then the cities and the townships came on board with the idea.
Indeed.
Yeah. And it probably helped that, actually now thinking about it, that you have each mayor is on regional councils. So they're sort of the conduit to get their municipal governments on side if they're agreeing to it at the regional level.
Right. And, you know, we could have a very, very long conversation about the pros and cons of Waterloo Region's wonderful two-tier municipal government system.
And that's another show we're going to do. So we've got a lot of teasers going here because I know you want to expound upon that. So I'd look forward to that conversation. So the other thing though I wanted to touch on, you had talked about was if a counselor has an idea, because looking at the dynamics, okay, it always seemed to me that, and I said this to you the other day, I said there's like the 14 most powerful municipal positions, I don't know if it's 14 exactly, are the mayors of the townships and cities, the 3 chairs of the regional committees, the regional chair, and the chair of the police services board. And the reason I say that is because it's all budget related. These are the key drivers of the various budgets that go on. And oftentimes I have the impression that the mayors and the regional chair really drive the agenda, and maybe because they're the ones that are elected municipal wide. So I don't know if that, provides them with some basis for that, but it always seemed to be that way. I'm not saying it is, but let's step back from that for a second. Because you mentioned, and I agree with this, a counselor with an idea getting support of the majority of their council can also have an influence on the direction and agenda.
Yep, exactly. And, you talk about the staff council dynamic. So, when I would deal with individual counselors, you as an example, Rob, and counselors would say to me, I have this idea. I want to move forward on this. How do I do it? And some counselors and I would say this is maybe more true of the mayors, would wish that they could basically just tell me what to do.
It wasn't me.
uh,
I never did
maybe,
that.
because maybe in their local municipality, that was the dynamic. And
it is the dynamic.
It is. But in the region, we had 16 regional councillors, regional chair and 15 other councillors. And so one of the things I would say consistently is staff took direction from council as a whole, not from any individual councillors. Now, we would provide information to individual councillors, if they requested it, and, try to be as helpful as we could. But direction on big issues, and especially direction on, resources, how we're going to allocate budget, how we're going to allocate staff time, what we're going to focus on, I would say that needs to come from council as a whole. And so my encouragement to individual councillors with an idea was, you need to talk to your fellow councillors, bring it up at a council committee or council meeting, and seek council's endorsement of staff pursuing an issue, and direct staff to do A, B, or C. And then as the CAO and the municipal staff, we would have very clear direction. We would know that the majority of council actually wants us to look into this, rather than, this is Mayor Deutschman's greatest idea.
Okay, I don't like the way this is going. No, just kidding. So totally. So you could, a counselor can go to staff with questions, get some questions. But if it was to research a concept about something or other, I remember there were times when we would have a vote about whether we would get a staff report on something. And it makes sense, especially now that you're telling me this, because, you're doing all these different things. And if you got 16 different people coming to you with 16, a bunch of different things, then it's not coordinated. It's not organized, right? It's not professional. But, for staff, clearly you get guidance from council, which is the 16 people, not an individual councillor. And if council says, this is what we want, and again, it's like 9 to 7, say, this is what we want you to do. That's what you do, right? It's the majority vote.
Yep.
So if a councillor has an idea, you get a seconder, you put it, you bring it forward, you have the debate, you have the vote. And if it's supported by a majority of the people there, then that's what staff is going to work on.
Exactly. Yep. And, I think to me, that's good governance, and it respects the roles of council as a decision-making body and staff as an implementing body. And, I always said my role as CAO was to be the linkage, the bridge between 16 member elected council and 3,000 plus regional employees. And to make 3,000 plus, and to make sure that the regional staff were playing their dual role as well as they possibly could. And one role is provide the best possible information, options, analysis, recommendations to regional council. There's one really important job. Council makes decisions on big policy issues and resource allocation. And then our job as regional staff was, how do we implement this in the most efficient, effective, responsive way we possibly can? And that was the how. And I would always encourage councillors to stay out of that, stay out of the nuts and bolts. We had a really good professional staff. Once council gave us direction, we were awesome actually at implementation.
Let me ask you this. I just thought of this. How did you feel about all those councillors being engineers around the horseshoe?
So one of the things I learned pretty quickly, my background was in water engineering, but one of the things I learned pretty quickly, everybody, not just councillors, everybody was an expert on transportation engineering. Where should we have stop signs, traffic signals, road widening? Everybody was an expert on that. I
remember one of the first issues that I dealt with at the regional level was the roundabouts.
Yep.
And the block line one. And I remember looking at it and I'm thinking, okay, this is, at some point it was 3 lanes down to 2 lanes to 3 lanes to 2 lanes. And I just thought, again, I felt responsible, or I felt a responsibility to comment, because as a personal injury lawyer, I'm thinking, okay, I'm thinking about seniors trying to maneuver this, and other people, and the confusion. And I remember we were all around that, and you know, we had a vote about reducing the three down to two, and I thought, wow, you can. That was my first real experience of change. Not that it was major, but it was something, right? And yeah, it was very, very interesting. But I know some people would get annoyed about those that were being engineers around.
Yep. Yep.
Roads.
Roundabouts brought out the, the traffic engineer and everybody.
Oh, well, especially Franklin, right? I mean, down by St. Benedict, is that the high school?
And there's still, you know what, Rob? They're still studying that.
I know.
I saw recently they're gonna, hire a consultant to do another review of what should we do with that intersection.
I know. I remember there was talk about looking at a bridge over that, sort of like that University of Waterloo bridge over the road that none of the students use.
Nobody uses it. Yep.
What's the quickest path, regardless of how many cars are going across? It's Frogger. Yeah. It's real life Frogger.
Yeah.
So, what was it like for you come election time? Wondering, because now you're dealing with a certain set of council, and then you could have a different set of council. What was your mindset or perspective on that? I'm just curious.
Yeah. So as a public servant, you figure out relatively early on. So don't take this the wrong way, but there's an expression like you don't get to choose your family, right? And
right.
So as a public servant, my work version of that was, and I don't get to pick my counselors. They are picked for me, just like
by 30%. By 30% of the people.
I know. Yeah, I wish that was higher.
Yes.
But yeah, so it was always a little bit of an unsettling time as we went into municipal elections, because we never knew what the outcome was going to be. I think we were fortunate in Waterloo Region. I think we had really great governance over the years. And I think overall, the community was generally satisfied with the governance and services they were getting from the region. And what that meant was we actually had a fair amount of continuity and stability, which I actually think was really contributed to our ability to get some really important things done. Is we had some continuity and stability, especially at the regional chair level. Chair Sealing was there for
your decades. Whole time. Yeah, your whole time, was he there, or your whole time?
He was, absolutely, and for years before I started with the region.
There's arguments about for and against incumbency. That's definitely an argument for incumbency in terms of the consistency that people like Ken bring, and some of the other, I don't want to mention other councillors because they're still there and might run again or whatever, but Ken definitely was consistent force there, and could still be there.
Yeah. And the other thing I would say is, though, every election we had some new regional councillors,
right?
And not wholesale change. Like some municipalities, every now and again they vote out the whole council and have a whole new council. That's actually can be quite disruptive. But having some new councillors every term was awesome, actually. And they would, I think you were an example. Bring new ideas and ask new questions, like, why do we do that? And sometimes there's a great answer. Other times it was, oh, you know what? We haven't thought about that for a while.
Sure.
We're kind of in, status quo mode, and new councillors bring fresh perspectives, fresh ideas. So I think in a municipal election, having some continuity and stability and some new councillors with fresh ideas and fresh perspective, great balance.
I just want to touch on that, though. For some people, though, they're not comfortable in the position once they're elected. And what I mean by that is they're not sure what to do, like the nuts and bolts sort of thing, right? With respect to how do I bring a motion? What am I doing with this budget? What's the conflict of interest? Why are we in camera, not in camera? It's almost like you run for a certain reason, you get elected, but now, you know, in order to make change or whatever, there's rules and procedures you have to follow. What would be some advice you would give to newly elected, and even some that have been around for a while? Because I saw experienced people that were not, definitely clearly didn't know what they had to do in order to do what they wanted to do. So what some advice would you give to people that get elected?
And it's a really good point. You know, regional councilors are the board of directors for a multi-billion-dollar organization.
Yes.
Right? Like, and I don't sure that councilors always appreciate that. Like, truly, you're the board of directors for a $1 billion plus, call it a holding company with about 100 different lines of business. Like, if it was a private sector, that's what it would be.
Right.
A $1.5 billion holding company with 100 different businesses and 3,000 plus employees. So that's what you're becoming the director of. And so it is a pretty steep learning curve, both in terms of what's the business and also the rules around governance, because it's governed by the Municipal Act. You know, it's quite complicated. So I would have a couple of pieces of advice for newly elected councillors. One would be, you know, whatever the way you learn, different people learn in different ways, but some people learn by reading. I would say read everything you possibly can. I actually provided to some new councillors, you know, I would say, you know, sort of seminal documents, like really important things, you know, read this. So that would be, or others people learn, you know, through interaction. So I'd say, you know, go and talk to as many people as you can. You know, immerse yourself in what's going on. That would be one piece of advice. Second would be try to find a fellow counselor who would serve as a bit of a sounding board and mentor. You know, somebody who's been around for a little while, who can help with the political side of how do you get things done? How do you move things forward? And, you know, we did have a really professional staff. I think me and the department heads, and
absolutely, 100%, 100%.
We had an open invitation to counselors, you know, go and talk to the senior staff. And I think the senior staff were quite generous with their time. You know, the Craig Dyer, Chief Financial Officer, would meet with individual counselors and walk them through, you know, the finances of the region, the budget document, the budget process.
Yeah, Craig was great, and I didn't get much interaction with the person before. Larry
Ryan was also great.
Yeah, he was fantastic for the short period I got to meet with him, but then he moved on to private practice, and then Craig came in. And Craig actually helped me put together 2 budget proposals, and he was fantastic because we sat down, we went over it, we talked about things, and he was great to, I felt bad taking his time on these things, but, you know, there were some things I wanted to try and see and do, and without taking a whole lot of time, and he was very gracious to help me out. He was
so fantastic. That would be my advice to counselors is, you know, go and meet with, and different counselors have different interests. So I would say, go and meet with the commissioner or directors in the areas that you're most interested in. And they will spend the time to walk you through issues, trends, you know, things are coming up. And that I think gives counselors an idea of, you know, what are they content with that's already going on, and where do they want to see some change of direction.
I just want to touch base on the, just go back to this documents interaction, the mentor thing was interesting because I think I had the best seat in the House during my 4 years. I was between Doug Craig and Sean Strickland. And, you know, you couldn't have had 2 more active, you know, different styles, but guys that were, you know, engaged when they were there, engaged in the debate, what was going on. I loved it. It was a great spot to be in chatting with both of them, you know, while you're sitting there. So they were, to me, they were a bit, you know, like mentors as well, because, you know, I remember though, one time I had my BlackBerry sitting on my desk and I had it on vibrate, and Sean, it starts vibrating a couple of times, and Sean got annoyed. So he looked over and he goes, "You see that red light blinking? That'll tell you if you got a message or not.
You
But
had two very experienced regional counselors there, in
well, and Doug too. I
Doug
mean,
Craig
Doug,
and
Doug is Doug, and he's going to be, a strong Cambridge advocate. But it was always funny because I'd see him. I always knew he was ready to go off because he'd write about 3 or 4 words on a piece of paper, and then when it came his time to talk, boom, he just went on off those 3 words. It was pretty interesting. On documents, though, when you suggest documents, is it things like the rules, policies, and procedures, conflict of interest, Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, those sorts of things? Is that when you're talking about documents
yeah.
for a
So you
new
know what?
person coming in?
Yeah, there'd be different documents on different issues. So on some of the council governance things, I think some that you referred to, we had I think there was a policies manual, but there were also guidance for new councilors that sometimes the Ministry of Municipal Affairs put them out, AMO put them out. So there was sort of governance things, and then in addition, there would be some pretty significant guiding documents that previous councils would have approved. So I'll give you an example. Everybody's a transportation engineer, right?
Yep.
So the region had a series of successive transportation master plans that were the guiding document. But this was the direction that
Right.
council was going, that staff were actually implementing. And so, if a council was really interested in transportation issues, I would say, read the current transportation master plan, because that's the direction that the region is going, because that's the direction regional council approved.
Yeah.
And you would get back from staff, why are we doing this? We're doing this because it's in the transportation master plan and we're implementing it. You might not like it, but that's what we're doing. So there'd be these master plans, and some of them were quite readable, some of them were not as readable, but master plans would be one. And then on some issues, there would be really significant staff reports that were, I would call, sort of seminal, milestone reports. If we do get talking about ION at some point, Rob.
I think it's going to be another show. I'm giving you the heads up now.
I'm sensing that. There was a really major milestone report in June of 2011, and that was a huge milestone in the evolution of the project. It set out, here's what we're planning to build, here's the financing and funding strategy, here's the implementation plan, and it was a pretty substantial document.
Yes.
But that guided the next, 5 to 10 years of work. So, so if a counselor was coming in saying, well, what about this ION thing? And where are we at? And I would say, read this one report, which provides the background, the direction, and that's why we're doing what we're doing. And it's the path that we're on.
And that's the key. These documents provide the continuity, provides the ongoing guidance for staff, and it provides, because each council is like handing the baton to the next council. There's going to be some same people, but you can't get everything you want done in 4 years. Right. This is a living, breathing, ongoing, organic thing. And, staff is there for as long as they're there until you retire and someone else then takes on your position and carries on. But with council, it's like, every 4 years you're up, either you're up for election or what have you. Just a couple of things that are crossing my mind. You mentioned, the counselors are the board of directors. Okay. Mm-hmm. Who's the CEO?
Yeah. So, we're governed by the Municipal Act, and the Municipal Act is clear that the head of council, the regional chair, is the CEO of the corporation.
Yeah.
And so that's always an interesting question. But then the Municipal Act also goes on and talks about, well, what are the roles of a head of council? And so unlike the CEO of a private corporation, the head of council is still only one vote around the regional council table. And so I would say, although on paper, the head of council is the CEO, they don't necessarily have the same authority as the CEO of a private corporation. They still are only one vote on council. And I'd be interested in your reflections as mayor, how you embrace that role as CEO. And then, all municipalities either have, city manager, a CAO,
Yeah.
a senior staff person who typically by bylaw has a whole bunch of responsibility and authority to actually implement things.
Yeah, I mean, all elected politicians come to their position from a different path, right? And what I'm talking about is what is your history, your personal history. So I'm a lawyer, but I also ran a small business. I had staff of 10. I had other lawyers. At one time, I was even larger, managing a larger entity, and so keeping track of all that. So my view evolved as I became during my time as mayor, to looking at it as, yeah, you want to be business like, but you can't run it like a business.
Yeah.
You want to be efficient with the taxpayers' money. You want to be responsible. You want to make sure we're planning properly for the future. But, tell me another job where a newspaper reporter can call you up and ask you specifics about your business and your finances and everything else.
And you have to tell them.
Right. You've got to fully disclose everything. So everything
this
you do,
information is
right,
is disclosable. It's we call it Freedom of Information Request, FOIable. So you're working in a fishbowl.
Yes.
And the other thing is, in private business, because I worked in private sector and consulting, one of your big strategic decisions would be, what business do we want to be in? Right? Like, where do we want to compete?
Yeah.
Right? Well, as municipal government, the business that you're in is prescribed for you by the Municipal Act. It's like, here are your responsibilities.
Right.
Regional municipality, upper tier government, here's your responsibilities. Township of North Dumfries, local tier government, here are your responsibilities. And lots of times really prescriptive about, and here's how you're going to deliver on those. So you have less flexibility than a private business does.
Right.
But I totally agree with you. One of our mantras was, we need to be as efficient and effective as we possibly can be, because that's what taxpayers expect of us, and that's what we need to do. Efficient,
Right.
effective, responsive.
But how many private businesses at a board meeting have the public come in and make presentations that can basically alter the course of a plan as well? Right? It is totally exposed, and everybody has an opinion. Right?
Yep. And how many private businesses would hold their board of directors meetings in public?
Like that, yeah.
Like that.
Yeah. They'll have their annual meeting is public, but the rest of the board of directors meetings is not in public. No, it's private information. You don't disclose anything. And so even to go in camera, all right, it's very particular about the issues that you can deal with in camera. And I remember, the region, we had a, the region's very active. So there were a lot of in-camera meetings for purchasing properties and stuff like that. But I remember we'd always be in there, and almost invariably there'd be that question, is this something we should be talking about in camera or not?
Yeah. And you know what? I would say regional council and regional staff were actually quite sensitive to that issue.
Yeah. Oh, they were. Right? That's why we always talked about
it. And I think appropriately sensitive to it. And as staff, we knew that whenever we were dealing with something in camera, in closed session, that likely some council member would say, is this legitimate for closed session? Why are we in closed session?
Yeah.
And so that was one of our filters, is we need to have a really good answer for that. Otherwise, we should be doing it in open session. And there's municipalities that really abuse that. And more, that's becoming public. That,
well,
you guys aren't following the rules. And
yeah, I was listening to the ombuds person for Ontario talk just the other day, and I think one of the biggest complaints is this issue about whether it's a meeting that should be in camera or out in public. I think a lot of times it's not so much deliberately done as mistakenly done. And I get back to my people who are experienced sometimes. And here's the thing, the elected politicians don't, a lot of them don't know, not a lot of them, but many of them don't know what's right or wrong, even after they've been there a long time. And sometimes staff, and I've seen this locally, and we've seen some changes that have happened locally recently, where I felt that the politicians weren't getting the guidance that they needed to make the right decision on some things. And that's why I say the CAO position is just, is so important to.
Yeah.
So how did you feel like if you saw something that a politician was doing incorrectly, like an in-camera meeting or what have you, or what about a municipal conflict of interest situation? How would you approach that?
Yeah. So I had instances like that, and my first approach typically was to actually talk to the individual counselor and say, here's my view based on what I know of what's going on here, and I'm concerned that this is, not consistent with municipal act.
Right.
So I would say generally that was effective at, kind of correcting things. I was really, really fortunate at the region. We had a really great regional clerk, and we had a really great regional solicitor. And so, and sometimes councillors would listen more to the regional clerk and the regional solicitor than they would to me, especially the regional solicitor.
What do you know?
Yeah.
What do you know?
And so, if me having a quiet chat with councillor wasn't enough, then I would actually ask the regional solicitor, either talk to councillor so-and-so, or in a closed meeting of council, regional solicitor provides some advice to all of council about what they were up to. And, I think our closed meetings, 99% of them, the regional clerk was there, and generally the regional solicitor was there.
I remember one time, one we kicked everybody out except you, but we won't talk about
it. Yeah, I remember that too, yeah. But so that's how I would deal with it is, we had great staff, and I would say, inappropriate things can happen for various reasons. So one is just oversight, as you described. Somebody's not aware of what they should be doing. So that's easy. That's easy to correct. Sometimes I would say in smaller municipalities, council doesn't necessarily get the best advice that they could or should from their staff. I don't think that happened very often, if at all, at the region.
No, I think it's a function of the region is this larger entity, can afford to hire, anyway, it's sometimes the staff, it's like I said, when I walked into, sort of by analogy, we had no planner, we needed a planner because we had to have a planner. And sometimes we're just at the I'll say lower tier just because upper, lower, I don't want to mean it's less, but it's a little harder at that level. And I remember with the Municipal Conflict of Interest Act, I had that conflict all through the ION with the building, which I didn't realize until I was elected that happened. But I remember a senior politician, not the regional chair, but a senior politician saying to me, "Oh, that's just interest in common." Which is, the argument, like, because we do taxes, well, we all pay taxes, so we're not in a conflict of interest when we're voting about taxes. And I say, well, no, I don't think everyone's got a property that's like within 800 meters of a stop or whatever, right? So it just led me to believe, that's when I kind of started to realize some of these guys don't really know what the rules are.
Yep.
And the Conflict of Interest Act is like 15 sections long. It's a very short thing, but it has tons of case law under it.
Well, and, Rob, to just your point on that, the other option that I think the region had available for councillors, especially related to conflict of interest, is you could get a legal opinion. And I think the region had an allocation to pay for councillors' legal opinions about
after it did, it came up.
Yeah. And and it may have been as a result of some of those questions that came up during that period of time. And so that was sort of the last recourse is like, if as a counselor, you need individual advice on your own circumstances, here was a way to do it, to keep yourself on the right side of the Municipal Act.
Yeah, I was able to kind of determine it was pretty clear in my case, but even some of those opinions were wishy-washy too. But
well, how many lawyers? You're going to get how many opinions, right?
How many engineers? Anyway, so listen, Mike. We're going to end the show on this note, but I just found this discussion so interesting, and I really appreciate your candor in terms of this discussion today. So hopefully you enjoyed it, and hopefully you won't mind coming back for another podcast.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to come back and love to talk about ION, and growth management is always related to ION. So we'll talk about those two things together.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. So this has been another edition of the Old Grey Mares podcast. I want to thank you for having listened and tagged along with us. Thanks again. All the best.